Awesome. Yeah. Well, glad to be here, everyone. My name is Zach. I go by Windfall Drifter in Core. Work as a member of Team Meta, doing some cool projects for Manticore. I've been doing that for a couple of years now. Been able to do a number of things in that space. Done some environment art, character art and props. Done some animation stuff in there. Learned a little bit of scripting along the way. It's been really a cool journey, and I've been able to do these workshops and talk about some of the stuff that I've learned. We're going to look at environment and terrain today. Kind of give you the general overview and hopefully touch on some things that will help y'all in your projects here for this jam. I just have been taking a look at the link to the different prompts uh, for this. We've got some sci-fi cities, some forests, and some harsh kind of ice and desert environment kind of ideas here, which is really cool. That kind of takes care of one of the first things you usually want to do when you're doing environment is to get some references, whether you actually collect a reference board or if just do some Google image and kind of get the idea of what you want. It's always a blend between getting good references and having kind of an idea of what you want to make and taking a look at the core content and seeing what we actually have to work with, because you may have an idea for something that if you tried to kit bash it, it might end up being really complicated, and especially if you are planning on using, say, a particular rock structure. If you want to make a rock formation that you see in an image, and you start looking at the rocks that we have here, and you're like, oh, I gotta combine like 5 different rocks together to make this shape, and then you want to duplicate that across your whole scene, right? That can get, pretty you know your object count can start getting a little high unnecessarily. So it's always a balance of finding what we have in the catalog and using that to convey the idea that we see, the image that we want to create. Um, so yesterday we did like some kit bashing and stuff. So I'll probably touch a little bit on that as we go, but primarily the main thing I think is that's really good to get started with is just terrain, talking about all the things that terrain can do. I usually just get rid of the default floor. And if I don't, I definitely get rid of this can't overlap triggers, just a personal nitpick thing. Like making sure that all my defaults are reverted there. To create a terrain, we have a button up here for the terrain creator. A couple different things. You could certainly import from Height I don't do it too often, but it is possible to import some kind of PNG in your grayscale that will give you a starting point for terrain. You can set all your voxel size and your height multiplier here to determine just how big and how steep all of your inclines are. Typically, I'll just go to generate new terrain and take a look at some of the options that there are. Um, the biggest thing for terrain is usually deciding whether or not you need it. They're very big. They're sometimes hard to work with in programs uh, like Git. There's some, the file changes a lot if you're doing template work or trying to copy and paste between people. If you're collaborating, terrain is kind of annoying and stubborn and doesn't like to move. So sometimes you don't actually need a terrain. Based on the stuff that I'm looking at here, these prompts, I think, at least for the forests and extreme environments, a terrain would probably make sense to give you some of that natural feel. The other ones do seem kind of like their island. The cities, they do seem kind of like they're like a floating city kind of thing. So terrain may not be the necessary for something like that. You could always just stretch out a large plane and create a water uh, material on it, and then build your city there. But we'll start with terrain, and then we'll talk about maybe some solutions for building a city after we get started with this. Flat terrain is always a really good starting point. Um, if you are looking to do more like extreme caverns and stuff like that, there's a couple of different things that you could play around with. This ravines, if you just don't change any settings and generate ravines, is going to give you a lot of like verticality, a lot of cavernous type of terrain that you could work with. Um, you know, the default setting, if you're just, it's a bit overkill. It sounds a lot. It's a huge, huge, huge thing. And as you can see, our collision costs, our collision complexity is pretty insane when we just create a basic one based off the base settings for this terrain. You can always hit optimize here. In this case, it's not going to do anything. I could do simplify voxels. I think that might take a long time for this particular terrain, so we'll nix that one and look at some things we could do to maybe reduce that. So if I go to my ravines, I can reduce maybe the depth, maybe to like 10. I don't know, if that's going to change too much, but something I can do is change my terrain size to be quite a bit smaller. I'll leave the voxel size at 1 meter for now, and let's generate that and see what happens. So, obviously not as impressive. I changed that depth quite a bit, but if I even go back and keep my depth of 50 and I just changed the terrain size, already I'm looking at something that's much more manageable, right? It's always good to have, some room to sculpt, because as you sculpt and make changes to this terrain, your file size, your collision complexity is going to go up. And it's definitely something to consider as you're going along with it. The main thing for terrain, I would advise against using terrain to create something that's cool, that's meant to be seen in the distance, because we have levels of detail on our terrain that can't be, I guess, cleaned up or manipulated in any significant way. You could set this to say, I don't want any LODs. I want this terrain to look exactly like it does in the editor at runtime. And, that's fine. But I think more often than not, that's going to introduce more problems. It's going to be a lot of, all those triangles are going to be rendered, and it's not going to simplify at all. So with a max LOD of 0, everything looks exactly the same. The default is 32. And if I play, you can already kind of see some subtle changes along the extreme points of the voxels, the extreme edges and stuff. Not too distracting there, but if you have a really complex thing or things that are really far away with your terrain, that LOD can simplify it too much. So, if I wanted to make like a distant mountain, I wouldn't probably try and do it with terrain. I would maybe choose a rock, and stretch it out and stick it way off in the distance, or use a hill or something, just to ensure that that isn't going to be distorted whenever I'm actually playing. As you stretch up large objects for things like distant terrain, sometimes you want to disable the distance field lighting so you're not getting weird shadowy artifact things on there. Potentially also disable casting shadows if it's something that's super far away. But say I wanted to make some distant mountains, something like this hill one is a pretty good starting point for something like that. The unfortunate thing is, as you scale these things up huge and start trying to move them, sometimes they're too far away and you can't actually select these handles. So, it's a bit hard to navigate. I think the best way to do it, instead of trying to scroll wheel or change your camera settings up here, sometimes the best thing to do is just to select and press F to focus. You could even duplicate this and make it really small in focus, because the scale is going to impact how close your camera focuses. So if I wanted to get back to the starting point, the spawn point is a really good object to back focus to. Just something that I've navigating the viewport on huge projects is really kind of a pain. It's half of your time spent seems to be just scrolling around trying to see things. For distant things like this, sometimes it's nice to create a separate material. Say I make like either let's do cliff is usually a good starting point. By default, this smart material is going to look really, really small and tiled when something's super far away. There are certain materials that will have a kind of a distance mask that the tiling size will change the farther you get away. If I was going to use something like this triplanar composite, it looks still pretty tiled, but if I get close, you're going to start to see that it has a different tiling for near than it does for far, which can be pretty useful. For something like this, it's still a bit too far away to use just a uh, regular material. So back here, if our big hill, let's rotate it a bit like this. If I was going to do something like, again, like maybe a cliff is kind of a fun one to start with. If I immediately turn off smart material and just use the normal, it already looks pretty good. That's going to give me a lot of good texture in there. Instead of having to add a bunch of geometry and a bunch of other static meshes to create that illusion, sometimes simplicity is really the best thing. So as this gets farther and farther away, it's going to start clipping with something. It's actually going to clip with the sky. So the default size for the skybox, for the sky dome, is actually kind of small. If you're really looking to try and get some distance, you can always scale this up. It can be scaled non-uniformly, which sometimes gives a weird feeling. I think my X and Y would probably want to be scaled uniformly. The Z you can kind of maybe play with. It's going to change uh, how your clouds kind of hang. Sometimes a slightly squished in the Z sky dome can make the sky feel a bit kind of stretched out and low and cool. But I think just playing with that to get the settings that you like. Uh, Again, uniformly scaling it up is just going to give you more room to place distant objects before it clips uh, with the sky. And the biggest thing I think that's really going to make an environment is if you have the ability to use fog. Environment fog is one of the best tools that we have to create the illusion of distance. This object right here, this hill, is just being rendered fully. There's nothing that's changing how it looks, whether it's right in front of my camera. If I move this to camera here, apply that same material, uh, this is gonna, the color is gonna be the same, uh, you know, and if they're stacked up next to each other like this, there's really nothing to tell my eye that this isn't just a small, tiny one right behind this, right? Um, if we add an environment fog, just a basic environment fog default VFX, I usually will just stick it in the default sky. It can be put somewhere else. First of all, if we just drop it in, it's a dense enough fog that that hill is so far away it doesn't even render. The opacity of this fog, the density of it, it's such that it already puts that out of the way. So we probably want to adjust either the density or the opacity, depending on kind of what our desire is. I could make, my density is going to kind of start from the bottom and move up. And if I have that default density and my opacity goes down, it's just going to make it a little bit easier to see through. But the fog is still going to be high. Additionally, your fall off can be adjusted to change. Higher fall off is going to be more of a sea of fog kind of feeling. The higher that fall off, the more it is just like kind of fill up your deep spaces and then clear up as you get higher. So this is very good, like top of the mountain kind of feeling. Morning haze on a lake kind of feeling. Maybe a little bit higher density, a little bit lower fall off. I'm in the mist, I'm in the cloud, and then adjusting your opacity to whatever makes you happy. These settings can be adjusted to your heart's content. Your start usually doesn't need to be messed with. This is just going to be how far away from the camera. So if my fall off is way up again, if I'm right here and it's a little too much, and I want to be able to kind of have some space where I can see, it starts to look a little old school here, I think, with a super large start. So just kind of depends on what what works for you. Being able to see is very important. You don't want to give that up just in pursuit of something looking good. You got to be able to see what you're doing. The additional cool part about environment fog is if you wanted to get fancy, you can certainly do volumetric fog. By default, unfortunately, when you just click volumetric fog, it looks not like what you had before. Sometimes it's a bit off-putting. If you copy your color from your normal fog and you go stick it in your directional in scattering, it should look pretty similar to what you had before. This closer space is a little bit looking a little bit different. I think if I go to my view distance, it's going to be similar to the start property of this fog of the default. I think fall off will still affect. Okay, and start will still affect as well. Your view distance is going to kind of determine how close to the camera that gets. The nice thing about volumetric fog is if you have things like lights in your scene. Let's say I do a point light or something. Point lights and any lights have a volumetric property here. Okay, so you can, I guess it's cast volumetric shadows is what I'm thinking of. Either way, in my fog, I can do my light absorption amount. And so if I have a higher light absorption amount, things like lights you can kind of see the light in the fog, which can be really cool if you're creating kind of a moody scene, a dark area illuminated by lights in a deep cavern or something. The fog doesn't necessarily have to be like true fog. It can be used to kind of again give your scent your scene a sense of kind of atmosphere. It doesn't necessarily have to be like a foggy mountain, right? Even with it all the way black here, my light is still. I'm going to see it, the kind of glow of the light, and if I don't have volumetric fog, I'm going to see where the light hits on my terrain, but I'm not going to be able to see that glow. So just something to consider. There's a performance cost to that. So if you have 1,000 lights and it's all fog and volumetric stuff, it can rack up. But definitely a cool way to get a cool effect. Let's go back and look at terrain a little bit. I like to start with fog just because I really do think it is one of the more impactful things you can add to your scene to create a really cool looking environment. Let's just reset this all to default. We'll put our big old mountain. Ooh, it's very large. We'll just do this. Again, there we go. Something like that looks nice. All right, nice big mountains in the distance. When you've got your terrain selected, we've got a couple of different things we can do. Sculpting is probably going to be one of the main things that you want to do, and we've got a few different tools we can do. Whatever tool you have selected, if you hold Shift, you will get a smooth tool, which when used will just kind of iron out your voxels in your terrain. There's a couple of different things that behave similarly, and we'll talk about kind of the differences. The smoothing is just, I don't know, sometimes it's a little too powerful, and if you're trying to achieve a certain effect and you're using smooth, sometimes you won't quite get exactly what you want. Because if I am continuing to smooth this, eventually it's going to deform down to just like the very, very, I guess it's trying to remove any, it's going to get very smooth. I don't really know exactly the best word to say for it. It's not going to reduce it down to like a pebble or anything like that. But it is going to just continue to remove any sharp edges, any place where there is a theme. The bigger this value is, so if I go to my smooth here and I change my size, I think the smooth is going to take the size of the brush of whatever tool you're using. So there's a smooth tool specifically here. You can adjust your speed and your strength. Lower speed, lower strength is going to take longer. You're going to have to hold for longer to achieve the same effect. If you find that it's just eating up your terrain, probably want to lower your speed, lower your strength. The more changes that you make to a terrain, even if I'm just smoothing here, it's going to continue to, you know, change your complexity, change your voxel memory, change your file size. Um, Now that said, if you start with a terrain that is in a certain kind of shape, you can get I get kind of a leg up. If I started with a blank terrain and had to sculpt the entirety of my idea from a flat terrain, I might end up having to do a lot more effort than if I started with, say, maybe my rolling, like Rocky Hills. Rocky Hills. Actually, I should say, there's a few terrains that have kind of random noise. You can choose a seed, your noisy planet, down through your rolling hills. Uh, these are going to give you some kind of noise-based terrains. Um, the sphere world is unique. We'll come and talk about it in a second. Uh, these other ones are kind of presets, pre-sculpted things, and you can choose your terrain size, your voxel size, and you can change the height scale. So one that's pretty cool, I really like the Rocky Meadows. My height scale at 1 will give me something that looks like this. Pretty cool starting point, kind of encircled. If I remove that and do the same Rocky Meadows with a height scale of 0.2, same terrain, everything is just squished. Could be useful to squish, could be useful to increase that height offset, just depending on what you are thinking. I think that sometimes it's tempting to go higher, but I think important to think about what your playable walk angle is. Um, by default, I think it's 45. I don't know if that number is actually exposed in your gameplay settings. You can look at your third-person player settings here. Walkable floor angle is 44 by default. You can put 180 in here, but you won't be able to walk up walls. I think 60 is actually the highest that you can do. You may be able to find a higher number than that, but if you're having trouble walking around, that may be something to look into. So your max LOD, I had briefly showed it off before. Basically, it's if you have a lower number here, anything above 0, you're still going to have LOD, where your terrain will kind of simplify as you move through it. Farther away sections will look simplified, and closer sections will look sharper. But I have not really seen much improvement in the actual visuals of having this set to like a low number. 0 is the only thing that I've seen that makes it look exactly like what you see when you sculpt it. So if you're sculpting a lot of detail in your terrain, it's important to know that with the default LOD settings, you're not going to get all of that set up. So if I come over here, and your basic surface tool by default is a 3D brush. So if I just click and hold it, it's going to add voxels and kind of pull towards your camera. You certainly can do 3D sculpting and deformation. You can create archways. If I just keep pulling towards it and keep extruding this out, there's nothing that's going to stop me from doing it this way. If I go and look at it from a far distance, some of those nice sharp edges are going to get cut off a little bit. I'm going to see some tearing and stuff. Again, that was pretty rough. I just pulled it through. So something you can do, right here it looks fine, but when we play, we see that it's having to cut too many corners. So a good rule to follow is you want to kind of, I guess, treat it like clay a little bit, and kind of make sure that it's strong enough to survive your LOD culling. If that's, I guess, maybe a little bit elaborate way to say it. Some things that you can do to kind of ease this and make it a little bit more natural. Certainly you could smooth, but and smoothing is going to be pretty destructive, uh, especially in 3D areas like this. Uh, you can always just continue to add using the surface tool. Flatten is actually pretty good for archways like this. If I just click, it's going to kind of fill a little bit. It is going to flatten it. So I think small bursts are always good. It's a good kind of approach for any of these tools, is to click a little bit and rotate, make sure it's all looking the way that you want. Um, if you are using your tool and you hold Alt, you will enter the destructive version of whatever that tool is. So in this case, we're still flattening, but we're kind of lowering. So this is, one good way to do that. When you have elevated or kind of pillars and you're trying to smooth that out, again, you can hold Shift and use your smooth. That's one way to smooth it. It will, again, kind of eat it up to nothing if you are not careful. Something that I like to do for this is the trim tool. By default, it's additive mode is going to, I guess, kind of backfill is how I think of it. So if I've got either a sheer cliff or a kind of recessed area, and I start filling it in here, this is going to just fill in the gaps. My lower area is going to stay preserved for the most part, and my upper area, this is just finding an angle and filling it a bit. It will go and try and get underneath all this stuff too. So it is going to be 3D. And if you hold and kind of swirl, it will continue to go. The angle that you do this from it's always kind of, I don't know, I usually am really bad about this, but it's good to square off and kind of look at what you're trying to do. I think sometimes I get excited and I'm like, let me do this all over here from this one angle. And that can sometimes end up with some unintended results, and the angle's not always going to look how you had in mind. So I think scrolling and moving around while you're doing this is very important. It can be done on the side, but you're going to see that kind of overlap where it's trying to fill in and your brush size is bigger than the space that you're manipulating. So you can adjust your size here as well. Fall off is going to be another property on all this. So I pull all this back and decide to do the same kind of effect on this. If I increase my fall off, you will see my brush will change. It's a very soft, faint center point here. If I do my fall off, you'll see that inner circle will go out to meet the outer circle. So with a 0 fall off, I'm going to have very sharp edges. It's going to be filling up right to the edge of that brush size. With a fall off of 1, I'm going to have a much softer fall off as I'm doing this brush tool. Things are going to more gently fall off from the center. Definitely depends on what you're doing. You'll find a setting that works for your environment. The destructive mode of this is going to do the same thing. It's going to preserve everything top and bottom. It's just going to carve off edges. So if I am doing this destructive mode on here, it's not going to carve any more into this hill. It's just going to again trim the edge of whatever cliff or rocky kind of surface that I'm doing here. As we're working on this here, let's see, we can do a backfill a little bit more here. My workflow is usually to do a little bit of backfill, a little bit of smooth. I'll usually do just like a click or two of smooth because of how strong it is. It's just a little bit more intense than you usually need. And just kind of find a setting that works there. The big thing for here is, if I'm doing this, my goal is that this is going to be a walkable space. I really should think of terrain not as cosmetic, but as functional, as walkable. This is, I want to make a surface that the player is walking on that is, uh, something that I can't kit bash, right? I can kit bash a mountain with rocks, um, but if I'm going to walk up a mountain path, you know, if it's just a bunch of kit bashed shapes, you're going to see those seams, right? You're going to see where the meshes intersect. It's not going to feel very natural. Um, so if I wanted to say create this really cool, maybe rocky entrance, maybe this is like my teleport entrance when you load into the scene, right? Maybe I'll do a cylinder. Just stick a nice polished cylinder in here, and this will be our spawn in platform right about there. Make sure we're not clipping through. And we'll stick our spawn point right here. So when we come in, we're here, and we have these cool pathways that we can walk down. Let's say I want this to be kind of, I'm looking at kind of the desert one and the icy one. Prompts for inspiration kind of right now, just thinking about terrain and not really worrying too much about buildings and stuff. But what I would probably do here is I would start taking a look at getting some rocks and thinking, I'd like to have maybe some spiky rock formations that kind of point the player towards the paths. So maybe the nice thing about the transform tool that has that's been updated is this little point that you can drag and it will stay connected to your surface of your terrain. Super useful in all situations, particularly useful with terrain and making sure that things are all contacting the surface of your terrain. Maybe bring in one other rock here. Sometimes I like doing these. I like getting these rocks in first as I'm going along, just because I'd like to get the basic idea of the terrain. But the biggest thing that makes terrain look cool is that it conforms and seems like it behaves with the static meshes that are on it. You could do a really great terrain, sculpt it all up, and then plop in some rocks, and it would look pretty good. I think the thing that really makes uh, it believable and seem really connected is if you've got your rocks that feel like they're connected. You can build up a little bit of terrain around your rocks. So sculpting is one way that you can kind of ground your static meshes in your scene. And then the other way is to use materials. So once you've kind of started to get your terrain sculpted, I know there's a number of different ways you can approach sculpting and terrain painting. You could do all of your sculpting first and then do your terrain painting. You could immediately put your terrain paint on there and then start sculpting. When you go to select paint, if you don't have a terrain material applied in your properties here, you can create a new one to paint. You can always just use a blank material on your terrain. It's not usually the best idea. It's kind of ignoring the coolest part of terrain, which is the painting. But if I just threw sand on here, it's passable. It works. Definitely takes some of the effort of terrain painting out. If you just know it's all sand and everything else is going to be static mesh, you certainly can just do one blank material, or default material. However, the cool thing about terrain is that you have 4 material slots that you can use to paint, and those material slots have a top and side channel. We don't have the ability to set the angle at which that side starts. That's something that I think would be really cool, just to help make cliffs a little bit easier. But the materials can be edited, and they have the newest changes where you can change your albedo and brighten it and change your roughness. So if I wanted to do sand as my main material, but I didn't like this color, I wanted it to be a little bit different, you can just desaturate it all the way, and then you have full control over what color you want. So say I wanted something a little bit softer like that, I can immediately do that, which is really awesome. Your side material, again, it's going to automatically populate vertical sides to a certain angle. The number of materials that you have available to you for these material slots is a little bit less than the full catalog. There's certain things that you can't use for this. That's just how it's set up. But you can manipulate this how you'd like. Get it kind of to your liking, and then once you have a material, you can start painting it. Just like before, you can do fall off to make it a little bit softer. You can adjust your strength. You can also adjust your target value. So let's say I want to put some, I really like doing gravel. I think gravel has a really cool look to it. It also allows us to play with the target value. Something I also like to do for certain materials is to use the same material for top and side. So if I've got some gravel here and I want to have some gravel to kind of add some extra texture coming down this area here, I start painting. I'm liking it. I notice that this slope is a little too steep, so I'm going to go back to my sculpt, fill it in, and what's going to happen as I fill it in is my terrain painting is going to get a little distorted. So as you're creating new voxels, it's coming in at the default material, whatever your base, first slot material is. So as you're doing this and you're painting, you're sometimes going to go back and forth and have to repaint. So sometimes it makes sense to do all of your terrain sculpting first. I still think that painting as you go can be really helpful to kind of see what your scene is looking like. I think it's a little hard to abstract how it's going to look without seeing the paint on there personally. So cool, I've got this going. You can edit your materials as you go, and again, now that you can see the colors update in real time, it's huge for making adjustments to your terrain colors, because I can line this up exactly how I want. I don't have to do all the guesswork. I absolutely am thrilled by this change. And then I can copy here, make sure that it's going to be the same up there. So something that helps with your, before I go back and start painting around these rocks here, something that helps just in general with your terrain painting here is to make your target value lower in certain areas. So if I do like a 0.6 and I just paint and hold down the mouse all the way, it's going to look like that. If I do, first of all, if I do 1, it's going to look like that. And then if I do, let's say, a 0.4 and hold it down all the way. So we're going to be able to kind of paint by height using your target value. So if I am looking to create kind of a blend or a transition, I can go through with a 0.6, go through with a 0.5, go through with a 0.4, and very smoothly transition from this one material to the next. You certainly can just paint a target value of 1 and keep your strength low and just kind of do some Bob Ross little circles and feather your way. That's definitely a little bit more, again, painterly. You're doing a little bit more of a true painting on there. But sometimes it does help to just say, I know that I want it to be at 0.45 is like the number that looks good for this. And then you can actually crank your strength up so that you're not having to hold as long. And you can just go through and fill in where you want that extra kind of texture on there. That's definitely, I think, the real cherry on top with terrain is painting in lower target value to create a blend between your areas here. And then, yeah, if you've got stuff like this, where your rocks are, having some kind of material to break it up is going to help. If you start getting to low target values, like if I do a target value of 0, I'm not quite sure why it must be certain angles or something, but basically your fourth slot will sometimes sneak in if you have a target value of 0. So it's or a lower target value as you're painting, um, which can be a little annoying. But if you just reduce your size, go back to your desired one, and paint smaller, you can pretty quickly overcome that. So something that's also really cool about terrain is you have foliage. It doesn't have to be just plants. If I wanted to do, let's say, a little rock, let's say I want a rock pile, uh, by default it's going to go into your first material slot. When you have that foliage object selected here, you can select which channel you want it in. So if we put it in our gravel section here, you can change how far the objects will spawn in. You can get really wild with it. I wouldn't go. You could probably blow up your computer if you get too low. So 1 meter is kind of my I know that's my safe my safe number. I don't go below 1 meter. Sometimes I don't even go much lower than 1.2 or 1.4. By default, I believe these foliage meshes that get spawned in do not have collision, which for something like this doesn't really make sense. I wouldn't enable collision on a field of rocks that are spawned in this way. Um, you know, I think that it's easy to just overclock collision and just go a little too wild with it. Um, Something that I like to do if I was going to, uh, let's just repaint this to be the same. What I like to do is kind of concentrate and do more burst kind of foliage. So if I was going to take these rocks, and let's say I wanted to have a nice boulder right here, what I would do is probably go through and paint a small area of my uh, gravel around it and have some rocks kind of populate near it. You can adjust the properties of these foliage instances. Also, if you're like, I like the idea of this, but those little rock piles aren't working for me, you can, once you have you've made settings, you've made changes here, you can just go replace the static mesh and do something different. Maybe I just want to they're a little bit too big, so I can go and do some settings. I can do uniform scaling. Say I don't want it to be smaller than 0.4, bigger than 0.6. Have a little variety there. You can do non-uniform, or you can just do the X and Y. Again, not necessary for what this particular one is, but the big nice thing for things like grass would be to align to the surface. So let's say I do have some little patches of grass here in my desert. We'll go and add grass. Tall grass is always fun. And we will stick it in here. So on a normal kind of flat-ish area like this, it looks okay the way it is. If we go and start painting on more of a slope, my grass is going to kind of float off to the side. By default, it's going to surface up. We can go and set to, or terrain up, excuse me. Surface up is going to align it to the surface, which is going to make grass look a lot better. Additionally, if we knew that we wanted some dirt to go up this path, but we didn't want the grass to go all the way up because it would look a little weird on this, we can set our height. And oftentimes this is easier to do once you've actually painted where you want your material to go. So we know that I want this dirt to go up the hill. Let's go and set my height to, say, my maximum height is going to be maybe 20. Lower. Okay, so 10, maybe 12. Not so good with meters. Okay, 12 looks great. So I can keep painting my dirt up here, and my foliage is only going to spawn uh, below 12 meters. It's a bit harsh right there, a bit of a cutoff. What I can do is have a fall off for the height, and it will fade. So if I go for 2 meters, it's going to kind of fade down. Just for the sake of this, let's increase our density a little bit. Maybe we set this to 13. Okay, so it's fiddling. A lot of this is going to be fiddling, so you can kind of get what you want with it. You can also say, this is looking a little wonky here on the side. I'm glad to hear it, Cyborg Prime. My max ground slope angle for this foliage is 90 degrees, which is a little extreme. I may just want this to be, let's start with 45. Even then, that's looking a little bit much. Maybe 30 will do it for us. Everything over here is still looking good. I am getting a little bit of angle there. So sometimes, again, you could argue for sculpting everything first. I think getting the foliage and paint in there is important too, just because it'll help you see things that aren't working and make those adjustments while you're still kind of in the zone. The other thing is if you want to do foliage on the underside of an object, you can do that of your terrain. So let's say I want this grass to also be on the underside, but I want it to be a little different. We can right click and duplicate foliage. We'll say here the minimum is going to be 90 and the max is going to be 180. And we'll start painting under here. We'll have this lovely little kind of hanging vine stuff that we've got here. Some fuzzy chia pet underbelly here. We're still going to have those other settings, so it's fading up to 13 meters or 12 meters or whatever. You can see the density is getting less up there. With super dense bits of foliage like this, something to consider just from a performance standpoint is also to take a look at your spawn and your cull property. So if we spawn it in at the lowest we can do, which is 32 meters, as we back away and get close, things are going to spawn in very abruptly. Something you could do is increase that a little bit and then go through and you can change your cull settings to whatever you'd like. Let's say, by 64 when it spawns, and I want it to be completely faded out. So, if I make my screen a little bigger here, you'll see that those instances are fading in very, very gradually, getting a large kind of fade on them. May not be exactly what you're looking for, but for super dense things, that may help reduce your triangle count and your draw. And hopefully help performance. So with grass there, so we've got about 10 minutes left. I focus mostly on the terrain side of things, just trying to kind of get the overview there of what I like to do for terrain. Something else real quick, one other thing to consider is there's an additional paint channel. I guess it's more of a modifier, it's not an actual material channel. You can choose to say I don't want foliage in a certain spot. So if I choose my paint, this leaf paint foliage one, and set the strength to 1, or excuse me, the value to 1, 1 is going to be no foliage. So if I know there's a spot that maybe this one little spot right here just wasn't quite working for the foliage, everything else is looking great, I can just paint an area of no foliage. Similarly, with my target value of 1, I can paint wetness. So if there's going to be a puddle somewhere and I don't want to just put a water plane, I can paint in water. And additionally, my target value will allow me to kind of have a gradient on that, and it's not just going to be an instant puddle. Get some pretty cool stuff with it, and then I can really fade in depending on what my needs are. Something that can help as you're working through this, especially with painting the non-foliage zones, is you have a debug material that'll allow you to see red is going to be my primary. It's going to go through these. I think this one's green. It's going to be yellow. This one's going to be purple, and I think blue. That's hard to see. Oh, target value, that's why. There we go, okay. 2 is blue, 1 is red. 1 is red, 2 is green, 3 is blue. I guess 4 is, I don't know if that's supposed to be black or something else. And then your checkered is going to show where you're not painting foliage. So if you wanted to say, actually, I do need to paint some foliage there, you can go through and paint back on that. And then I guess this lovely little tiny polka dot is wetness. So that can be very useful. And then additionally, if you're working through and you just have a bunch of foliage, you can hide your foliage there. You are able to do like fall off type, different masks for things. I usually don't mess with that. It's definitely doable. But again, I think if I'm thinking more about, what I'm needing from the scene, I think it's really easy to get carried away. I love sculpting terrain. I could just do a Bob Ross and do it all day and just, make cool looking stuff. But I got to remind myself that it is very much about what the what the player experience is gonna be, and using the terrain to kind of enforce that and help that. So I'm thinking about where they're standing, where they're looking, what are they able to see, right? So if I'm gonna have them spawned in right here, maybe I want to make sure my mountain, is that way. Go that way. Is in the direction of. Oh, why can't I not go? There we go. So now when I spawn in, I see this lovely mountain off in the distance, right? Think about where your player is spawning in and looking. Again, guiding them with the path where they're supposed to go and the areas that they're supposed to be able to interact with. Something that I have not been able to do a lot. I don't do a lot of environments that are cityscapes and stuff, but something I was able to give a workshop based off of some fellow meta members' slides. Malamery is an artist that's worked on Spell Shock 2. Kepu's an artist that's worked on Strike Team and a number of other projects. They both made some really awesome stuff. But one of the things that they've talked about doing is when you're setting up, say, a cityscape, is kind of starting with some white box, I guess, prefabs, or I guess you could call them templates, but not templates in the true sense, more just thinking about allowances and areas that the player should be able to go and not be able to go, and making very clear kind of distinctions between the two. So this is a pretty obvious blocker, but I know that I can tell that I'm going to be able to jump on top of it, right? And maybe I can jump to that one. I know that I'm not going to be able to jump up to this one. If this was a little bit lower, maybe it would be a little too misleading. Maybe I'd be stuck trying to jump up there, and it's like, so creating kind of some good feeling sizes of objects and then building your scene, white boxing it out, using those, kind of having your starting point, and going from there. I did notice some cool concentric looking cities in that default image, or those prompt images. Something that I just like to recommend, that I like to do. There's a lot of different ways to deal with concentric shapes and everything, and keeping things even. Let's say I wanted to make a cool pillar thing like this. Oh, let's put it in a group. Um, let's say I wanted to create kind of a floating looking shape here. So maybe what I'll do is create this here. And what I typically like to do is duplicate whatever object I want to spin around. While it's selected, select the center object, and then you can rotate that to whatever angle you need. If I need these two to go here, I can duplicate those, keep doing that same format. So now I've got all of my objects correctly centered on this object, this center one here. Yeah. If I wanted to be a little fancy, I could create a group within this. I could put these 4 objects in the group, and then I could scale the group up, and that would scale it out from the center or scale it in. Again, just depending on kind of how you want to set things up. That's just a quick way to think about kind of blocking out things that are concentric. If you're doing something like this, that's going to be like walkable platforms. We do have some large cylinders, some large rings, large pipes, large quarter pipes. Those are going to be a lot better for large scaled up, say, platforms. Right, already here I can kind of see these, these vertices really clearly. It's really not meant to be scaled up, 13 times. So if I go and select all these, replace them with large ones, it's going to explode a little bit. But then if I scale them all back down, we're going to see much smoother edges here. That is going to be a higher triangle count. So again, if you're doing something, a small prop, a small detail, an environment piece, you probably don't want to use a lot of these large ones for that. It can get really dense. A good check for that is always to go through and just pop in a wireframe. This is going to be quite a bit more than if I was just a plain cylinder. Right, we can see just pretty clearly just how many more triangles make up the large one. Get very noticeable for large walkable surfaces. Definitely would encourage that. The level of usage for this terrain, I don't. If I optimize here, I want to say that this is tied to max players. And I'm not quite sure. I think this is something to do with server collision cost stuff. Basically, if I am setting this as a 1-player game, I think that's gonna basically be a lower collision budget. I don't really quite know the significance of it, but I know if I set to 16, I'm gonna have a higher, higher budget here for that. So I would just keep an eye on it. I don't think it's going to be. I've not run into nearing that limit in the time that I've been making terrain, and I've made some pretty wonky, wild terrains. If you do start getting to that limit, I think it's some kind of combination of these two. I think optimize is always good. Simplify voxels can take some time. The bigger your map is, the more complex it is. It can sometimes lead to some visual changes. So sometimes it may not be. It may require some going back and some extra attention. But this should reduce collision complexity and hopefully lower that number. Your object count. So sometimes when you're doing this, you can get a lot of objects, especially if you're kit bashing like distant, uh, you know, Okay, so I don't know if that actually helped or not, but we did simplify the voxels, so that makes me feel good. If I'm kit bashing a lot of stuff, stuff, collision is definitely something to keep in mind if you have very distant things way out here. My hill that's way out here, I could probably stick this in a client context, and any other distant uh, any other distant creations that I'm doing, can live in a client context if I know the player's never going to run into them. That just immediately takes care of collision uh, and keeps things organized. Let's see. I guess also for these, since these rocks have gotten a little large, if you do want to have collision on rocks, it is okay. I would make sure that it's not going to be foliage that is like spread across your entire map all the time, because the spawn distance, it's always max. It's always the max if collision is enabled. But if you don't want to go ahead and place all a bunch of little rocks that are around here, you do want collision, you can use the foliage tool for that. Yeah, but if you see here, like when I just go across this line, you see my terrain kind of has its LOD pop a little bit. I think the real reason I don't worry too much about messing with the LOD settings is even if I set this to 2, that LOD pop is going to happen in the same spot. So it's like it's not really helping reduce the distance between where the LOD pops. It's just, I think, actually making a bigger jump because you're not having more incremental LODs. So I don't know. I go back and forth. I keep messing with it every once in a while, but I've just found to leave it at 32 is usually the best course of action. Let's see, is there anything else? Let's see if there's anything I can think about that I've learned to do in terrain. Painting materials. Shape tool is actually pretty cool. I don't necessarily use it all the time. Yeah, loading is going to be the thing. Yeah, if I was going to do a forest of trees, I really probably would not do it using the foliage system. I would probably have, you know, I would probably have a paint layer, let's say 4. I would maybe do like leaves, or forest floor, and I would probably have like a foliage on 4 that was like fern. Again, I would probably reduce my distance between instances. Maybe not quite that much. And then I would align to my surface. And what I would probably do is just have trees that I place in that section, and then I would just use the paint to get the ground color the way that I want it and the ground texture, and then I would use foliage system to fill in the little bits. That's something that I think is still a bit of a I have to work on it a little bit to try and keep myself honest. But if I go through and do things like little nature sticks, right? And I stick those in the ground, and I do some fern, and I do maybe some what's one that I like? It's a flower. Oh, it's not a flower. It's a daisy patch, I think. Yeah, the daisy patch I think is a really good one to kind of fill in some ground color, ground coverage, and then something else. One other thing for this, I think that is sometimes I forget to mention. You can change your material, but if I stick in, I only have access to the catalog whenever I just double click on this material slot. So right, I can make a 9 slice daisy patch. It's not going to really be what I want. If I go and find my daisy patch in the core content, bring it in, I can create a new custom material from that. And then what I can do is remove that, go back to my terrain, and in my foliage, I can apply my custom material. By default, it's going to look the same, but now I have access to color, uh, you know, picker, and I can change the, the wind weight and the intensity and all that stuff. So if you're going to be using a terrain, some foliage for terrain, and you're going to want to do custom stuff, I would definitely set up that material sooner so that you can go through and start making those adjustments and see it, all over your scene, right? Again, being able to change that color and see it update on the fly is just massive, and it's really, I think, one of the most helpful things that we've got at our disposal to really fine tune your scene, right? You can get everything kind of set up and start messing with these values and get these colors the way that you want, and it's custom materials for anything like that, right? Even if I'm not using the foliage system for these trees, if I'm going to go through and know that I'm going to have a lot of trees, I would set up a custom branch so that as I'm going through, I can update that color on the fly. Check it out. Pass for painting. Yeah, definitely. Doing little passes is always good. I think, the biggest kind of philosophical advice that I can offer is, take breaks. Not even from like a mental, uh, keep yourself sane break. Because I know it's really easy to get into the zone. It's a lot of fun to make terrains, but I don't know. We look at it for too long and we get a little biased. We don't have a mirror. With art, traditional or 2D art, you can usually flip your canvas in some way and look at it from a different perspective. So taking a night, sleeping on it, closing your eyes, letting them rest a little bit, and looking at it with fresh eyes can really help make sure that your scene's going in the right direction. If the work is also fun, right, you're in the right direction. So I went a few minutes over. I'm glad that I got to talk about terrain and kind of went down the rabbit hole. There's a lot of things, and the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll get with it. The tools, I'm still finding different ways to use tools that for the sculpting that are nice, right? This sculpt shape stamp is really cool. I don't use it all that often, but it is pretty sweet for getting some kind of preset shapes for your sculpting and help get more organic things than just the basic brush. Lots of settings. You can do lots of adjustments and stuff like that. You can align it to the view, which can be really interesting. Again, I do this kind of as an afterthought, just because I don't normally do this. I don't have a big workflow for this, but if you wanted to say create like a wild kind of arch thing, just keep adjusting your view, and can make some pretty interesting creations. So. And again, if you're hoping to get like a perfectly smooth kind of sculpture thing, I definitely thought about using this to create like a giant statue of Athena, kind of huge bronze statue. And it's like, yeah, it works a little bit, but then you've got the terrain simplification that happens with the LOD. So not quite. We'll have to just keep kit bashing statues for now. But yeah, if there's no other questions, that's pretty much all I've got. I'll be here for another couple minutes. So if anything does come up or we need any clarification on stuff, I'm still checking out that chat. So thanks again for having me.